समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
As the strategic drama surrounding Trump, tariffs, and the selective targeting of India over its purchases of Russian oil has deepened, the debate has also intensified across the United States, India, Europe, and larger Asia alike. Amidst this growing cacophony over an issue that sits squarely at the crossroads of geopolitics, regional dynamics, geoeconomics, and domestic posturing as well, I'm joined by a rare expert, one deeply versed in US presidential politics and its foreign policy towards South Asia and China. So, very pleased to welcome Dr. Evan Feigenbaum, who is with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he oversees its work in Washington, in Beijing, New Delhi, and Singapore. You know, Evan has served twice as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and has advised two Secretaries of State and a former Treasury Secretary on Asia. He's also been a professor at the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. Dr. Feigenbaum's career has spanned academia, government service, think tanks, the private sector, and in that process, he has wide knowledge and experience of three major regions of Asia. So very pleased to welcome you, Evan, to the WorldView with Swasti, and grateful that you have agreed to do this discussion with me.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, thank you. So let's just start with the most obvious thing. Of course, as you know, that we here in India are pretty miffed with what has been happening, and we feel that we have been wronged, of course, by Donald Trump's behavior and his unrelenting onslaught of tariffs and additional tariffs. But since you're in the US, let's just start with what is the mood in the US strategic circles on what has happened to US-India strategic partnership?
Well, I think the mood in American strategic circles is what I would describe as depressed. But I think in some parts of the American body politic, the mood is actually quite euphoric. And that's what's interesting about this, is that a lot of the ideas that have been at the core of American foreign economic policy, trade policy, have really gone out the window amid the political moment that we're in. So the president seems to have tapped into something here domestically, because there's an awful lot of the American, as I said, body politic, especially in the Republican Party, that is following him along with this, a little like the Pied Piper. You said something interesting in the setup. You said that India had been singled out, and I can see why people in India feel that way. After all, when you layer the 25% base tariff with the 25% that they've imposed because of Russian oil purchases that he objects to. In other words, basically secondary sanctions. You get to India being tied with Brazil for having the highest tariffs in the world at 50%. It's easy to see why you feel singled out, and especially because the oil tariff is awfully unique. However, there is not a country in the world that has escaped this tariff onslaught. And so it's important to remember that Mr. Carney in Canada, Mr. Lee Jae-myung in South Korea, Mr. Ishiba in Japan, von der Leyen in Brussels, every country in the world is facing this really remarkable shift from the United States. And so they're struggling both to deal with an American foreign economic policy that they're not used to, but also the personal whims of the president, who's clearly driving this. And so I'd say for strategic types, that's a little bit depressing because there's an unpredictability to it. It's not really anchored in a strategic concept. And particularly as it applies to India, I think many of us feel that it's left the United States worse off in the region as a result.
No, I understand your point that it's not just India alone. In fact, there are many in India that have been wise enough to really point out to fellow Indians that, look, what he's doing to you is not something he's doing to you alone. He has actually, ever since he came back to office, he's been treating his partners much worse than his rivals. And it started, with this entire thing that you kept mentioning. But let me just get back. I think what sort of intensifies the mood in India of being singled out and being victimized is the singular targeting on Russian crude oil purchases. So one of the things which is often repeated, I'm sure you are no stranger to Indian media discussions or strategic discussions. One thing that is often pointed out is that initially, it was the United States and the European partners, basically the G7, that encouraged this, purchase in order to keep the global oil supply stable, etc. And yet now Donald Trump is behaving as if India has defied the G7, solidarity or something, and gone too far in singularly targeting India on it, because Turkey has also been buying it. European Union themselves have been buying it. China has been buying it. And especially on China, his silence has been rather deafening when you compare the kind of cacophony you hear in India.
Yeah, you'll get no disagreement from me on that. In fact, I've spent a lot of time over the last few days in the United States explaining to people the Indian perspective. I think the Indian perspective, as I understand it, basically has three components to it. One is that this is essentially blame shifting, that there's been a collective failure of the West over nearly 3 years now to stop the war. President Trump, after all, ran for office saying, don't worry, I can stop it in 24 hours. So here we are 7 months into his term. The thing hasn't stopped. And now, essentially, I think there's a perspective in India that this is attempting to shift the blame onto India. I understand that perspective completely, and I won't argue with it. I think the second piece of this is that there's a hypocrisy to it. And you were teasing this when you talked about other countries making oil purchases. It's not just about oil purchases, though. Actually, if you switch up the commodity of reference from oil to, let's say, gas, there are European countries that continue to buy Russian gas. And the United States, for its part, has continued to trade with Russia in some, although a limited set of domains. So there's the hypocrisy to it, plus the China factor, the fact that China is a larger producer of oil. I think the biggest thing, and the one that troubles me the most as somebody who's been involved with U.S.-India relations, is what I would call issue linkage. This is not the first time the United States and India have complained to each other or made an issue out of one another's relationships with third countries. After all, for the time that I was in government and thereafter, we've heard lots from Delhi about the U.S. relationship with Pakistan, about the U.S. relationship and negotiations with China, and what that might mean for Indian equities. We've heard a lot about how the United States left Afghanistan during the Biden administration. And on the flip side, the United States has had issues with India's relationships, for example, even if we put Russia to the side, with Iran in the first instance, and with Myanmar or Burma in the second. But the thing is, in all of my experience, the US and India never allowed those differences about relationships with third parties to bleed back into their own bilateral relationship in a way that was completely debilitating. They didn't always do what each other wanted, but they were sensitive to one another's equities. And they certainly didn't punish each other or let these third-party relationships, as I said, bleed in a way that rode the relationship off the rails. So I think what's mostly concerning to me about this is it really undermines and vitiates one of the core strategic understandings that enabled the progress between the United States and India over the last 25 years, which was, for all these differences on relationships with third parties, we would never, ever let those ride our bilateral sort of off the road. And that's essentially what's happening now. And it's very unrealistic on the American part. I mean, the reality is India is not going to junk its relationship with Russia, just as the US isn't going to junk its relationship with China. And so I think it comes from a place of unrealism that has had a very unsurprising response in Delhi. And since we go back to your first question, it's left the US much worse position with India than it would have been and should have been.
Yeah, so but it's interesting, I observe a paradox there, which is that, you with your answer, or I seem to understand that what you're suggesting here is a kind of an equivalence of India's relationship with Russia and United States' relationship with China. On the contrary, I would argue that United States' relationship with China is openly that of rivals. There is an economic dependency factor, of course, but as far as United States a pivot to Indo-Pacific is concerned, focusing on countries like, India is concerned, and of course the allies such as Japan, South Korea, etc. That entire thing is coming from basically managing the great power contestation, which is between the United States and China. So, are you saying that there is a sense of equivalence, or are you simply putting it this because it is just an easier way to explain?
No, I'm not saying there's an equivalence. You're saying there's an equivalence. So I didn't try to imply that. What I just said is that if our focus is how to build productive US-India relations at a bilateral level, we need to be careful not to let third-party choices that reflect our broader foreign policy bleed back into the bilateral, because there are always going to be aspects of our relations with third parties that we disagree with. So using tools of economic coercion and economic warfare like sanctions in this way is extremely debilitating. So number one, as a principled point, I'm not establishing that kind of equivalence. But then second, it's actually a critique of American foreign economic policy and of the underlying approach the United States is taking to India now. The US will get nowhere with India by essentially trying to get India to curtail some aspects of those relationships. The irony here is I think there might have been an opportunity for the US to persuade India to curtail some of its Russian oil purchases, but doing so in the fashion that it did, with the instruments that it's used, and in the highly public fashion that it did, which frankly, I think unnecessarily backed Prime Minister Modi into a corner politically in terms of the domestic politics in India, makes it harder to get to the destination you want. And so if you go back to your first question, which is what's the mood in the strategic class, it's depressed because this is not a very strategic approach. And I would add, it's not a very principled approach either, which brings us to the point you were making. The United States and India at a principled level should share some principles about international order that would allow them to treat each other congenially as partners. I don't think the US is doing that. The US might argue, and the Trump administration might argue, that given the kind of actor that Russia is now on the international stage, perhaps India should be more sensitive to that on a principled basis. But the problem, as you know, and as you're implying, is it runs up against a long history of strategic ties with Russia for India, but also sentiment and emotion. So we also need to be realistic about it.
So one of the things that I now understand from your argument is that so far, United States and India in the last 25 years of how, when they put together the strategic partnership, which has been pretty consequential, or is meant to be consequential, were able to successfully compartmentalize their foreign policy, okay, and focus on the convergences, maximizing those convergences and minimizing the divergences and not letting other third parties interfere, which has changed with Donald Trump, is what you're trying to say. So Absolutely. Is that also change then from Donald Trump 1.0 to now? Is there also change there?
Well, a lot has changed from Donald Trump 1.0 to 2.0. He's much more unburdened and unconstrained. He's clearly driving the train rather than taking advice. And he's much less interested in strategic arguments at the geopolitical level than he was before. You mentioned in the setup the idea of a kind of Indo-Pacific coalition to enable a stronger U.S. posture in the region, but also I think it was implicit in the way you set that up to constrain Chinese power. There's nothing about the approach the Trump administration has taken since January 20th of this year that suggests that that's the case. If you're trying to build a coalition to constrain Chinese power, you certainly don't create the possibility of a rupture with each and every one of the allies and partners that you would need to do that. And so the U.S. has tariffed every single one of its allies. It's tariffed every single country in the region. And so it's created points of friction with those countries in ways that make these more abstract geopolitical arguments much less saleable at a practical level. That's not a strategic approach. And as I was saying earlier, there's not a particularly principled approach to this either. If there was a principled approach, you would have some theory of what you were trying to achieve, of market competition, of the underlying principles that ought to guide the international system or the international economic rules. That doesn't seem to be what's happening either. What seems to be happening is basically America first transactionalism with a heavy dose of what I would call rent-seeking behavior. And so that's neither strategic nor principled. And so given that, I think where we are in Trump 2.0 is a much less predictable landscape. I actually feel for the government of India, as I do for many other governments around the world, in trying to size up Donald Trump and then negotiate with him. I've noticed there's been some criticism of Prime Minister Modi domestically that he could have handled President Trump a little bit differently, that the politics of this were not sufficiently sensitive from the Indian side. I don't want to lawyer that because I'm American, I'm not Indian, so it's not my place to play that out domestically. But I will say to give a little bit of credit to Prime Minister Modi that Donald Trump is not an easy person to negotiate with because there's no rhyme, reason, or logic to the way the United States is currently approaching this. They have tariffed countries with which the U.S. has a trade deficit in goods, but also countries like Brazil with which the U.S. has a trade surplus in goods. They have tariffed countries with which the United States already has an existing free trade agreement, like South Korea, and countries with which it does not have an existing free trade agreement. They have tariff countries, again, like Korea, with which President Trump himself has reached agreements in the past and then walked away from his own agreements, and then countries with which he has never reached an agreement previously. And as you see with the Russian oil purchases and with his threat of 10% for BRICS countries, countries like India belong to the BRICS group, he's also threatening to tariff countries for things that are completely unrelated to trade policy at all, foreign policy, counter narcotics, immigration. So how do you deal with somebody like this in this landscape? It's very difficult because it's just rank transactionalism. And if we're in a world of rank transactionalism, the reality is, every country has its politics. India has politics too. Prime Minister Modi obviously knows that because he's good at politics. He's been elected 3 times. And the United States, I think, and I've written this publicly, is insufficiently sensitive now to the fact that other countries have politics. Donald Trump clearly doesn't care about anyone else's politics. And so there's a lack of realism to this in the second Trump term that I think was still there in the first term. And that's a tough racket for countries around the world to manage.
Many in India would say that India did not read the Trump repivot to Europe properly, and shifting of the mood that he started to exhibit on BRICS countries and de-dollarization and all his attack that he unleashed that he said that he would unleash against those that are trying to de-dollarize, etc. So I would like to understand your thoughts because you're a China expert as well. What is your thoughts on BRICS? I mean, BRICS as a grouping, do you think they have an economic, strategic, security convergence of sorts? Or is it just about a non-Western order?
No, I mean, first, I think that's a somewhat unfair critique because, President Trump, can keep basically one thought in his head at a time. And I doubt he knows very much about the BRICS or what it is or who's even in it. There's a press conference from earlier in his administration where he famously thought the S in BRICS was Spain, not South Africa. So I think, probably he's been briefed on it in a way that led to some of the statements. He now has something in his head about the BRICS and de-dollarization. But if you think this is an intellectually well thought through or coherent strategic approach to countering the BRICS bloc, to the extent it even is a bloc, I think that gives too much credit. So that's the first thing. Where the BRICS is heading, to be honest, President Trump likes to talk about how he stops a war a month, he claims, and he deserves not 1, not 2, not 3, but maybe 8 Nobel Prizes. I was joking on Twitter yesterday that they call it X now, not Twitter. I was joking that at the rate he's going, that they should give him the Nobel Prize for creating a unity of purpose among the BRICS that would not otherwise have existed without his policies and his tariff approaches. It's been in the first 48 hours after the tariff announcement on India for the Russia oil purchases. We had Mr. Doval, the national security advisor, up in Moscow. We had Mr. Doval saying publicly that there was an invitation to President Putin to come to New Delhi and that the dates would come soon. Prime Minister Modi's going up to Tianjin in China for a multilateral meeting, first time in 7 years. So, I was being a little bit flip, but I do think that there's not really necessarily a unity of strategic thinking within the BRICS, but there's certainly a unity of grievance vis-a-vis some of the instruments the US is using. So I think that gets to your question. Can you build a coherent bloc on the basis of grievance rather than on the basis of shared strategic assessments and shared strategic purpose in the world? And my answer, generally speaking, is no. I think when form drives function, rather than the other way around, groups tend to atrophy and really grope around for purpose. What I mean by that is form, when you form a group, but you don't really know what it's going to do, and you have to grope around looking for something to do. Those kind of groups rarely cohere. The groups that have been most successful internationally are the ones where function drives form. You have a unity of purpose, and then you're able to build the organization around that. So if I contrast, NATO during the Cold War, where there was a unity of purpose to counter the Soviet threat, and the form that cohered around that, NATO became probably the most successful security alliance in history. NATO has drifted somewhat as the purpose became less clear. So again, when function drives form, you get coherence. When it flips to form groping for function, you run into more incoherence. So that's the question I would ask about the BRICS. What is the real unity of strategic purpose that unites, let's say, India and China in thinking about what regional order ought to look like in the Indo-Pacific region, much less globally? I have a lot of trouble seeing it. I mean, if there was a unity of purpose, for example, we would have had India joining the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which really wasn't even a necessarily completely China-centric group, because it's based on an ASEAN plus 5 country concept now that India has pulled out. But India pulled out partly because the politics of that in India were to see it as a free trade agreement with China, in which it was a sop to the Chinese for basically dumping of goods into the Indian market. If you can't even get to a trade pact that includes China, but includes, 13, 14 other partners, how on earth do you build strategic coherence into a group where China's the dominant player? So I think, from an American standpoint, the good news probably is that the BRICS is going to have trouble cohering. But the bad news is that every single one of those countries is now pushing back at the promiscuous US use of tariffs and sanctions in ways that actually could rescue it from oblivion and create greater purpose to it than would otherwise have been the case. And that's natural in geopolitics. People build coalitions of the willing around things that matter to them strategically and at a tactical level. What I'll be interested in actually at this upcoming set of meetings among those leaders, bilaterally, plurilaterally, multilaterally, is whether they develop a joint approach to dealing with the US. If they do, that's interesting, and we can revisit my question about form and function. If they don't, because this is something they really ought to have a shared approach to, and actually I expect that they won't, because Mr. Trump has been very successful at playing divide and conquer with countries in the economic front, then I wouldn't put too much stock in the long-term future of the BRICS.
Well, the other problem with the BRICS is basically the entire erosion of strategic trust between India and China, because we have fought wars, and very recently the way China supported Pakistan during Operation Sindoor and the level of that integration was also something that we realized very well, that India has not just a one-front destabilization, but a 2 or a 3-front destabilization. So what really comes in the way of this is not just Donald Trump's unfair economics or geoeconomics, but also, the fact that India and China have a completely, they cannot reconcile their worldviews, and of course their strategic priorities as well. But yes, that was an interesting thing to make, and I really like the way you elaborated how function should drive form, and those are the organizations that rather do well. Now, just
if
as
I can just say, on India and China, it's important to set the bar in the right place. I mean, the idea of a broad strategic convergence between India and China is fantastical, but the idea of at least a more stable relationship is not so fantastical. And my impression is that the Prime Minister, as well as Mr. Doval and Mr. Jaishankar, have been making some efforts to at least stabilize that relationship. And they appear to have had a little bit of success on that front. So that's not unrealistic. And I think that would give India greater strategic flexibility than it has right now.
In fact, it would also give India greater strategic time, because we also require the time to sort of build our own defense capabilities in a manner in which we require. So the tactical rapprochement has several benefits to India in the short term. So of course, we welcome the tactical rapprochement. Doesn't mean that it solved the structural problems at all. In fact, the structural mistrust has only grown, and the Ministry of Defense is very careful about that. But I certainly get your point on that. But since we are discussing China, Evan, also, help me understand this massive dependence that United States has in China on rare earth and the magnets. And I asked you this question because we have the same. We also have the same, and China has put a hold to that as well. So one part is why we are sort of having this tactical rapprochement is also because we realize that we probably are alone in this and we have to negotiate, all by ourselves, and there is no United States to help us there. But how is this managed in United States? You are an expert in China as well. I mean, how is this managed?
Yeah, I mean, the tragedy on rare earths is that rare earths are not in fact rare. This actually is a bit of a misnomer. There are rare earth elements all over the world, Australia, other places that have stocks of critical minerals. So we've ended up in this situation in part because of policy choices that were made over the decades in the United States and in other countries. So China has ended up in a dominant position that's likely to reduce over time as the United States and other economies reduce their dependence. It is a tomorrow problem as opposed to, let's say, a 2 to 3 year problem, because the recognition of this in the United States and elsewhere came late. And so some of the critical minerals partnerships that are forming also came late to do anything about this. I think what's interesting about this is both the tactical question and then the more strategic question about what we should expect from China. The tactical question is what to do about it when you're dependent on someone. And the answer has been, as you've seen, the differential in the response the United States has had to China on the one hand, and India and virtually every other partner on the other. It wasn't lost on anyone in India, for example, that the United States extended the tariff deadline for China within a 24-hour period of when President Trump announced the first 25 baseline percentage tariffs on India by tweet. So that wasn't lost on anybody, because first, the way it was done is insulting, but second, to India. But second, I expect this tariff deadline to keep moving along until the United States finds some kind of satisfactory agreement with China. This is largely self-inflicted. I mean, remember, rare earths, these magnets, those were flowing to the United States until President Trump came into office and started down this route. So it's always interesting for me to hear the administration describe China's turning the taps back on as a signal policy success. The only reason they were turned off in the first place was because the Chinese used it as a retaliatory measure. So I think at a tactical level, what I expect is that the United States will want to mitigate its dependence by trying to reach an agreement with China that ensures the flow of these things. And the US is in a stronger position than India and other players are because it has more leverage on China in the other direction. But that brings me to the more interesting question, is what can we learn from this about China's approach to foreign economic coercion itself? And I mean, to be blunt about it, they learned from the best. They learned a lot from the United States. The United States has been using export controls and administrative and regulatory instruments as weapons in its arsenal for a very long time. There are hundreds of pages of Chinese companies on the so-called Commerce Department entity list. The US has used export controls as a weapon against India. I mean, I was very centrally involved in the last phase of the US-India civil nuclear deal. Why did we need a civil nuclear deal? Partly because the argument from India was that the United States had no right to expect to have a strategic partnership with a country that was the #1 target of its non-proliferation sanctions. So the US had been pretty promiscuous in its use of sanctions and economic weapons. And China's now learned how to do that too, from the receiving end. So what's interesting is that almost every tool in the American arsenal now has a mirror image on the Chinese side. The US has a Commerce Department entity list. China has a so-called unreliable entities list. The United States has sanctioned individuals. China has sanctioned individuals. The United States has sanctioned corporates. China has sanctioned corporates. The United States has controlled certain commodities and systems, chips, certain kinds of technologies to China, supercomputers. Same thing from the Chinese end. It can be at the commodity level, like rare earth elements. It's also, interestingly enough, going to be at the systems level, where I think they're going to control the flow of certain technologies from China as well. So we're in a world where both sides have weapons of economic statecraft, and the Chinese have learned that from the US. It's interesting, there's so much focus on rare earth elements, but actually there's a lot of dependence on China, even at the lower ends of the supply chain. If you think about something like printed circuit boards, Chinese control something like 80% of the supply of PCBs to the automotive industry around the world, even in the US. They could shut that off too. So I think this is yielding a longer term conversation about how to reduce dependencies. And for President Trump, that's not displeasing because it fits very well with reshoring debates, the idea of America first, the idea of rejiggering supply chains. So we're moving into a world that's really, it's a different kind of globalization. I wouldn't call it post-globalization. But I think in a lot of commodities and in a lot of areas, even things like APIs, pharmaceutical ingredients that go into medicines, countries will want to become more techno-national. And China's part of that story, both on the receiving end, it's trying to indigenize things, and also on the sending end, because it's wielding export controls itself. So we should all get used to that. And sadly, that means we're probably heading away from an era of techno-globalism to something more like techno-nationalism, where people make it, what it is, and who makes it are going to matter in ways that they did not 25 to 30 years ago.
Okay. And since we're discussing China, can I bring you closer to South Asia and ask you if you think that the US, Pakistan, so to say, endorsing of each other and praising, of course, from the Pakistani side, it's always been profuse, but from the American side as well, we see a kind of an endorsement of Pakistan. Do you think this is done primarily to ramp up pressure on India, to basically show India its place in a crude way? Or do you think that this is something which is more significant?
It's hard to say because, as I said, with President Trump, there's not a lot of deep strategic thinking about any of this. He's highly transactional. He's a relationship-driven guy. And he doesn't think a lot about the underlying strategic consequences or benefits to the United States from this. I'm not, this is not my first rodeo with this in the India, Pakistan, United States triangle. The US has played footsie with Pakistan over many decades in ways that have rankled a lot of people in India, and people in India have objected to. And some of what I would characterize as missteps rhetorically and substantively by President Trump and by the administration that have, to be blunt about it, pissed off a lot of people in India are not new either. For example, the loose stuff that's come out of his mouth about mediation on Kashmir. He's not the first American president who said that. I'm old enough to remember when President Obama was running for office as a candidate and gave an interview where he muttered something about mediation in Kashmir. And there was a lot of hue and cry in India. So, I think I understand the concern, which is obvious and springs from a deep place of strategic interest in India. But I think you have to give it both the American discount and the Trump discount and understand that there are very few sophisticated people in the United States that are trying to rehyphenate the way the US looks at India in the world with Pakistan. Okay. To the extent that people with an ounce of strategic brain cells think about India, they really don't do it in the narrow context of Indo-Pak this, Indo-Pak that, the way they did in the years prior to the George W. Bush administration. I really don't think that's the case anymore. So, President Trump is who he is. He's highly transactional, but at a strategic level, I don't see the United States either rehyphenating things or tilting toward Pakistan in some way that reflects a lot of deep strategic thought. And I think we need to figure out, those of us who have equities in the US-India relationship, how to manage the Trump factor and ride this out without riding the entire relationship off the rails. But I understand completely what the concern is in India. And I think the reports I've seen about some of the footsie that's going on between the US and Pakistan, if I were an Indian politician or a diplomat, those would be very concerning to me as well. It's not realistic to think the US won't have a relationship with Pakistan. I'm not sure that's the expectation in India. I think you're used to this by now. But expecting the US to be smart about it and strategic about it, that's not an unrealistic expectation. And so people like me, to the extent we can get the administration to listen, I think we'll be making that case here.
That actually brings me to the last question that I want to pick your brains on, which is that where do we go from here? So, okay, this is a bad situation. There is a Donald Trump in the United States, and whatever has happened has happened. So, how do we salvage the situation from here? What do we do next?
Well, I'd say three things. I think the first thing is we need some kind of a tariff agreement because we need to put a floor under the free fall that's happening now because the bottom is falling out in the US-India relationship. I wrote a piece the other day for the Carnegie Endowment, the title of which was Donald Trump Risks Tanking 25 Years of US-India Relations. The original title of the piece was Donald Trump is Tanking 25 Years of US-India Relations. And I decided to hedge it and I changed the verb from is to risks. And within 24 hours, I regretted changing the title because the bottom was literally falling out. So I think the good news is my impression is the prime minister and the government would like to get to some kind of agreement that at least ring fences the worst outcomes. And I think their instinct is correct on that. And I think as we've seen with virtually every other country in the world, the president's a highly transactional guy. And it ought to be possible to get to something that works for the governing coalition, but also for India more broadly, economically and politically. And I hope we can get there because if we can't get there, then the bottom is going to continue to fall out. So I think prescriptively, the first thing is we need a kind of tariff deal because we need to put a floor under this. The second thing is we need to get the prime minister and the president together at some point. They have a kind of bonhomie with each other. They seem to get on. And I think it's a little bit unfair to criticize the prime minister for trying. If you know anything about Donald Trump, you know he's a highly touchy-feely, personal kind of guy. As I said, he's different in the second term than he was in the first term. But I do think these interpersonal relationships are going to be important. And frankly, with all due respect to Mr. Jaishankar, Mr. Doval, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Bessent, nobody matters in this administration except Donald Trump. So the PM doesn't have the wrong instinct because he's read the United States correctly in the sense that it's true that Mr. Trump is both the ultimate decision maker, but also the only decision maker. At some point, we need to restore some kind of working symbiosis between the two of them, because without that, you can't ride out the next 3.5 years, which is necessary. That then brings me to the last thing. I think what concerns me most is that a relationship that had become really depoliticized on both sides is now becoming incredibly and unbelievably politicized on both sides. And that was really the signal achievement of the last 25 years, if you think about it. I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State at the end of the George W. Bush administration handling U.S.-India relations. I ran the interagency process in the U.S. government at the working level around all of the elements of the final phase of the nuclear deal. President Bush was a Republican president who faced Democratic majorities in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. But the India bill at the end of 2008 passed with huge bipartisan congressional majorities. In the Senate, for example, the vote was 86-13. And Harry Reid, the Democratic Senate Majority Leader, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, all of them were working hand in glove with my boss, Condoleezza Rice, and us in the administration to get that done. So this really had been depoliticized on the American side. I see that coming back now, the politicization on the US side in ways, particularly on the MAGA right, that I find very troubling. What's even more troubling to me, though, is the politicization in India. This had not been politicized in India, at least since the trust vote in 2008. When not only did the government face a confidence vote in the House, but you may remember that many of the parties that are now in the National Democratic Alliance coalition governing India, who had been longstanding supporters of US-India relations, did not vote for the government. They actually saw it as an opportunity to bring down the government. And it was parties like Samajwadi that actually saved the government, by a larger margin than many people expected, but nonetheless saved the government. We got beyond that once we got out of the trust vote. And the BJP, the NDA, Prime Minister Modi have been driving US-India relations to new heights and in extremely productive directions. And so to see the politicization of this, which I will admit has been caused by President Trump and his actions, is very troubling to me. But it also ought to be said for those of us who believe, at minimum, a stable working relationship between the US and India is necessary, given the strategic challenges we face in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. So my hope is that on both sides, in Washington and in Delhi, that we can get back to some kind of bipartisan recognition or multi-partisan recognition that, notwithstanding the debates of the moment about tariffs, that we need to get back to thinking about this in a less political way. And to circle back to where I started on answering this question, that's why we need a tariff agreement soon. Because I think the trust is gone. The trust is gone in India, and that's sad to me. But we need to do the work of rebuilding the trust, and it's harder to do that in a highly politicized environment. So that's my number one prescription, and it's one that's important here. And to the extent that people in US politics are listening to people like me anymore, we're also arguing that it's important that this be a post-partisan issue.
Right. On that note, Dr. Evan Feigenbaum, thank you so much for taking the time out and helping us deconstruct whatever's going on in the United States. And I think the more important part of the discourse is, as you suggested in the last part, is that what do we do from here? Because indeed, the US-India strategic partnership is meant to be one of the most consequential strategic partnerships in the 21st century. So thank you for taking the time out, and you stay tuned for another episode of Worldview with Swasti.